You're looking at just one aspect in terms of powering the economy. But I want to take you up on something you said about population in terms of how hungry we are for, how many people are now hungry for power. And Mr. Rewane, that's where I bring it, to your door. Even for something as simple as the biometrics of budgeting, how many we are, but, in terms of where we are going. We look at 1960, 46 million. We look at 2015, 186 million, depending on who is counting. So some have said that we need to even first understand the size we are before we can even make any progress in terms of allocation,
True. If you don't know how many people you are, then you can't even plan. So but the question is the ability and the willingness to be honest about the head count. So that's, I think we are lacking in that. There's no data integrity as far as the population is concerned.
So how do you plan?
No, we have to use
rough estimates.
No, anecdotal evidence rather than empirical evidence and proxies. So if you say that in Osun State they have a population of 5 million, and this was a highly contested election, and in all put together, we had about 500,000 to 600,000 people that voted, and 50% of the population above 18. So where did all of them go to? We go to Anambra State, go everywhere, and then the anecdotal evidence does not support the empirical evidence. So the question of the truth and the inconvenient truth. So that's a starting point. But if you go into the population discussion, we will never leave here today. So why don't we just leave that aside? Well, we know that we have a problem. Let's have one BVN or one national identity so that we can solve that problem once and for all. That way, we can then begin to plan and execute efficiently.
Okay.
Dr. Adi, I will look at some of the indices. And that was the way Ijoma introduced this segment. We talk about some of the indices that generally affect people. They may not know that it affects them because maybe they are not economists, but this affects them. The rate of exchange, the inflation rate, people talk about minimum wage, vis-a-vis purchasing power parity, and all that. How are we doing in that regard?
You hear economists say nominally we're in the green, yes, but directionally we're in the red.
Yeah. Yes, so... and that may bring you to Malthus's theory, eventually.
Well, I don't want to sound alarmist like the Malthusian, because...
Because if we're growing at double the rate that the economy is growing, it means that every once in a while the population is doubling, whereas the amount of what the population is going to consume is only half.
Which brings us back to our population discussion.
Yeah, I think it's a very terrifying indicator if we think about it. Let us look at it from, more empirically, So if a variable is growing at X, it means that every 70 over X years, that variable will double. So we are growing at 3% right now. So in 70 over 3 years, that will give us about 23 years. Our population is going to double. So if we are growing at less than let's say 2%, so how long does it take per capita income to double? So that's going to be in about 35 years. So
the growth, the
now these are realistic. We are not trying to make it up. But unfortunately, nobody's looking at this. Okay, so you can see the impending, doom that is looking at this country. Unfortunately, nobody's thinking about it. So I just don't want to even talk about the interest rates, the NPR, and all of those things because they are based on data that is not reliable, data that doesn't exist. So I actually don't like to talk about macroeconomic issues because macroeconomy in Nigeria. Because it can be, I wrote an article recently where I said that macroeconomic policy making in Nigeria without thinking about the politics of the country is like clapping with one hand. So you don't have the data, so how do you plan? How do you, so let's keep that aside. So let's
look. You raised a very important point here when you talk about this argument that nobody is having. Because every other thing we can talk about in terms of the economy is already skewed. There's a problem with it if these two things are not in alignment. Yes.
There's an assumption that growth will continue to be at this level. You can do things about suboptimal growth. And so that's the challenge. How do you get the growth to leapfrog, i.e. by technology, by skill, by integrity, by all sorts of things. So you can get that growth up to 8 or 10%, while the population rate will remain the same. So you can actually catch up. But we are talking here of 58 years. 58 years of what? Wasted opportunities and suboptimal growth. So what lessons have you learned from the past? Right? Because Santana says that those who don't learn from history themselves are bound to repeat it. And there's replete evidence to show that we have never learned from anyone.
Just before you talk about that, I was going to bring in Mr. Chukwuka there, talking about what we have learned from the past. We've looked at managing the economy in terms of, population and figures. What about managing the economy in terms of debt? We'll see our external debt, growing from 10.3 billion 2015, now 15 billion 2017, currently 22.08 billion, and that's just external, foreign debt. And then when you come to local, 15.63 trillion is where we are right now. So I see this argument of, debt versus GDP. What it looks to us on plain paper is that we're borrowing our way out of this.
Or borrowing our way deeper into it.
Well, I would rather approach from the perspective that we do not seem to have a debt strategy. If you look back to 2004, when we had a debt challenge, when we worked towards exiting the Paris Club debt, at that point, our national debt, external debt was $36 billion. We paid $12 billion, we bought back, and then they granted us $18 billion debt, leaving us with only $6 billion of international debt. Over time, we have built back to $22 billion. Our total national debt in dollar terms is about $73 billion. If you convert the 15 trillion naira local currency debt to dollars, which gives you about $56 billion. So in effect, our current debt profile is far higher than what it was when we had a major debt burden. Now look at the debt service to revenue. Our debt service to revenue is approaching 70%. If you look at federal government revenue. And when we talk about debt to GDP, if you listen to the discussion in the morning during Chebale's program, it's misleading.
With the finance minister?
Yeah, because the reality is that we do not have any headroom for additional borrowing. The government is pushing for a debt restructuring so that they improve the foreign currency component of debt. But we have to recognize when you want to increase the foreign currency debt, you have to look at the robustness of your foreign exchange earnings. Our entire net of foreign exchange earnings is coming from sale of crude. Crude oil price we do not control. So if crude oil price should move southwards, then whatever we call as our capacity to service that debt becomes overnight weak. So we do not have the capacity to continue to borrow. Unfortunately, the government has not come up with a strategy to build infrastructure without continued borrowing. We cannot really build infrastructure from budgetary expenditure. We need to come up with a more robust approach. There is nothing that stops from adopting a PPP scheme. We've tried some options, we never really put it to a conclusive end. The reality is that if we have to develop this economy, it cannot be with the level of debt we are building. That debt currently is unsustainable. We need to change our strategy towards funding government expenditure. Finally, before I go, we said, government keep touting that, look, we are borrowing for capital expenditure. If you look at in 2006...
And infrastructure.
In 2015, our total capital budget was 1.5 trillion. If you sum up the entire 3 years of capital budgeting for the past 3 years, you have less than 5 trillion naira. Then if we have borrowed 10 trillion naira, what did we use the other 5 trillion to do? It simply meant we borrowed for consumption. So you can't point to what we have used that money to do. And as long as you're borrowing for consumption, you are not building capacity to generate revenue to pay back that debt.